Where? Um. So let the records reflect that no other business was discussed other than what was contained on the agenda. Also, let the record reflect that at 9:26 PM, we are reconvening into open session. Okay. Um. We are on 15.1. Potential board action on the consent agenda. Matthew Eaglin Daniels, contractual paraprofessional. I said through the names.
Yep.
Ariana Rubio, Shanita Stokes, Isabel Fernandez, Catalina Guerrero. And substitute teacher list, Saja Safi.
Yep. And then I read these all the way through.
Yes.
Mhm.
That's not right. Okay, and so notifications of resignation, Anne Quinn Manthe, Jennifer LaChanche, Kara Merkel, Chantel Matos, Lucas Dom, and Lisa Sertich.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Medina on the second. Mr. Medina. Mrs. Birkin. Mrs. Schroeder. Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.2, potential board action on non-renewal of employment of the following employees. Raya Kaha, ELL teacher at Ridge Central.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Mrs. Birkin. Mrs. Schroeder. Mrs. Lammle. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
Mr. Medina.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.3, potential board action to approve the hiring of Elizabeth Curran as a full-time special education teacher at Finley Junior High.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
Mr. Medina.
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin. Mrs. Schroeder. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.4, potential board action to approve a leave request for Gary I apologize, Garafalia Veru, from March 10th through March 12th, 2025. I'll make the motion. I'll second.
Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin. Mrs. Schroeder. Mr. Medina.
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.5, potential board action to approve a retroactive leave of absence for Amina Tursanovic, February 17th through February 28th, 2025.
I'll make the motion.
We have Mrs. Birkin on the motion.
I'll second.
Medina on the second. Mrs. Schroeder. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
Mr. Medina.
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin. And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.6, potential board action to approve leave request for Teresa Kuzel from September 2nd, 2025, returning September 29th, 2025.
I'll make a motion. I'll second.
Mr. Medina.
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin. Mrs. Schroeder. And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye.
Enjoy those grandkids. Yes.
15.7, potential board action to approve a leave request for Chantal Matos. March 19th, half day, 20th, 21st, 2.5 days total. I'll second.
Mrs. Bergen. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
Mrs. Schroeder. Mr. Medina.
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle. And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.8, approval of resolution authorizing and approving notice to remedy to certified employee Albert Johnson.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
Mrs. Bergen. Mr. Medina. Mrs. Schroeder. Mrs. Lebudzic.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.9, potential board action on resolution releasing closed session minutes and destruction of verbatim recordings 18 months and older.
I'll make the motion. I'll second it.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mrs. Schroeder, Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin, Mr. Medina.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.10, potential board action to approve special education coordinator contract for the 25-26 school year, for William Lynch.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
Mrs. Schroeder, Mr. Medina, Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin, Mrs. Lammle.
Aye.
And Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.11, potential board action to approve administrator contracts for school year 25-26. Megan Nothgale, Carrie Hilligans, Caroline Butreri, Catherine King, Emily Geyer, Jeffrey Youngberg, Julie Bazian, Leanne Kazmir.
Kazmir.
Thank you, and Fran Sotero.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Thank you.
Mr. Medina,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Birkin, Mrs. Schroeder, Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
and Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 15.12, potential board action to approve the superintendent's contract, Dr. Adam J. Thorne, for school year 25-26 through school year 29-30.
I'll make the motion.
I have Mrs. Schroeder on that one. Mr. Medina on the second. Mrs. Bergen, Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mr. Medina, Mrs. Schroeder, Mrs. Lammle, and Mrs. Petropoulos.
Aye. 16.0, looking for a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We adjourned at 9:33. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night and a wonderful spring break.